Hi everyone, we're happy to be here. So today we're going to discuss a research that we did shortly after the Meltdown vulnerability was published. Basically what we did is to examine the patches that were made, and we noticed that while it does mitigate Meltdown, it also opens the door for some other security protections bypasses, and we'll go through it today. So with me is Omri Misgav. He's the security research team leader at InSilo, and also past speaker in multiple BSides conferences. And I'm Udi, CTO and co-founder of InSilo, and also spoke in BSides several times, and Black Hat before. Okay, so just to outline the presentation, we'll start with a short introduction on speculative execution. We won't dive too much into the details. Then we'll talk about kernel virtual address space shadow and its internals, what it is exactly, how it enabled us to bypass some security mitigations, protections. We talk about the mitigations that were done, and also other stuff you can do with that. Okay, so as a quick intro, most processors have a rather rich instruction set, and each instruction is composed out of micro instructions or micro operations. Those micro operations are what actually the processor executes. And you can also see it on Intel manuals when you look into how each instruction is implemented, the breakdown of each of the micro operations that are executed when an instruction is executed. So about speculative execution. So the idea is that in order to improve performance, the processor can try to execute instructions ahead of time by guessing which branch is going to be taken or which instructions are going to be executed. So for example, if we have a conditional branch instruction, the CPU will try to guess which instructions will be executed and then execute micro instructions or micro operations ahead of time. Now, obviously, the processor can be wrong and choose the right branch to execute. And those cases, the actions that were done as part of the execution will be discarded. And we will call this transient instructions for this presentation. Now, while the state of the processor or the registers will not change if something like that happened, it will still have an effect, or at least this is the cause of meltdown on the general state of the machine by actually putting pages in the cache. So meltdown was a processor level vulnerability, it still is, and the ramification was that it allowed user mode code, even totally unprivileged user mode code, to read in a rather effective way the entire memory, including kernel memory, although it's not supposed to be authorized to access it. At the time, it affected Intel CPUs, and based on publications, IBM PowerPCs, and some ARM processors. And the idea was to leverage a side channel that was created due to CPU's memory cache. So if we take a look at the snippet below on the right-hand side, let's say that the RCX register points to some kernel address that's not supposed to be accessible. When it's broke down to the micro operations, the CPU may still fetch that address, and before it actually throws the exception, it will try to execute the other operations. Now, if you see the operations below, the last line, in case it will execute this micro operation, it may put in the cache one of the pages that are prepared ahead of time by the attacker in order to know what data was in the kernel address. And by checking the time it takes to access this page, it is possible to know which page exactly was accessed, and from that to know what was the data in kernel. Now I know that's a very high-level explanation. To dive into the details, you can go to the address below, but it should pretty much get us aligned on what happens exactly. So before diving to the mitigation, I'll just make a really short overview of virtual memory layout. So on 64-bit, we have a page tables that looks something like this. The base of the physical address related to the page table is found on CR3. And the first level is PML4. We'll discuss it more specifically on the rest of the presentation. And after you break down the virtual address and go through each part of the page tables, you eventually get to what is known as PTE. The PTE contains not only the physical address, but it also contains other bits that define the protection on the page, such as whether it's executable or not, whether it's user mode or kernel space, writable or not, and so on. One other thing to note is that there is a field called page frame number, which is used to get to the actual physical address. We'll use it throughout the presentation as PFN to refer to physical addresses. Okay, so the solution in high level was quite simple. If the classic model of operating system was to map the entire memory space in a single page table, both when user mode code is running and kernel mode code is running, like it is on the left-hand side. Now, after Meltdown, the idea is to remove most of the kernel space code and only map the user portion of the memory. And so even if something like Meltdown occurs, the pages are not mapped, they are not there, and so there won't be any leak. More specifically, to implement that, there are now two page tables. One still have access to the entire address space, and it is used when kernel mode code is executing. So you can see all the driver on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, there is what's called as a shadow page table, which contains all the user mode code and code that is used for transitions between kernel and user mode. And now Omri will dive into the details of exactly how it is implemented.
Okay. So we have two tables, page tables. Now it means that every time we transition from user space into kernel space, we have a new context switch only for the memory of the same process. Both tables, as we mentioned, the kernel page table, which is the full address space page table, and the user shadow page table. Those are terms that we're going to use later on in the presentation. Also, there are variations of this mitigation on Linux and Mac, but we won't dive into their internals, though they are quite similar. So the basic design, now that we have only a portion of the kernel mapped into two tables, means that we have to put the whole code for the transitions in one single place, so it will be easier to map it in the two different page tables. Now all the code from the transitions, all the routine that handles entering and exiting the kernel are found in a P section that his name is KVAS code, as you can see in the slide. Every transition routine now has two versions. The shadow one, which is present in that section, and the regular one, which is present in the text section, the regular code section, in case you have a newer CPU that is not vulnerable to this attack. Now, every transition routine has the second version that is accessing the shadow page table has a suffix of the shadow added to it, as you can see. And basically what this function does, it checks whether or not currently the shadow page table is being used, and if so, on the transition to the kernel, switches it back to the kernel page table, so operation could continue as regularly as it was before. And also the exit functions are also present. The exit functions from the kernel are also present in that same code section. So when we transition from ring free, from the user space into kernel mode, the CPU puts some of the data, it saves some of the data on the stack for the transition to occur properly, and the OS can later on use this kind of this data. Usually it's named the machine frame, which is part of the larger trap frame that the OS builds. Previously, without the mitigation, how the transition worked is that in user mode, the thread had its own stack, and when transitioning to the kernel, the same thread had a different stack in the kernel space. Now, in order to simplify things, instead of that, first we got a transition stack. This stack is the one that is being used directly when we start executing on ring 0, and it will be used in the shadow functions that we mentioned in the previous slide, and it will change also the stack for the thread's kernel stack. Now, this kind of transition stack is not per thread, but it's per CPU or per processor, per core, if you want. Each virtual address points to the same physical address on both page tables of the same process, and because of that, this means that the code section for the transition, the KVAS code, is placed in the same virtual address, so we can still use Meltdown to break KSLR. This is not something that was meant to be handled by the mitigation, and it's some sort of compromise by Microsoft. How the page tables work is actually by just copying the PML4 entries from both page tables, from the full one to the shadow one of the user space. So you only have to keep a very small part synchronized, and it's easier to do so. It's very similar to how the kernel is being shared between different processes up until now. So this kind of memory context switch introduces pretty much a big performance issue. There were reports back at the time that it cost a penalty of up to 30%, if I remember correctly. And in order to minimize the impact, some optimizations were made. First one is by utilizing the hardware. PCID is a mechanism that is used by that is available on newer Intel processors. And it basically means that the software, or in this case the operating system, can provide a logical tag for the memory address space. So when cache entries are being built by the processor, it knows to append this kind of tag to them, and then it knows to operate, when you operate in a specific context, to use just those relevant entries in the cache. Microsoft decided to use two IDs, one for the user address space for all processes, and the second one is for the kernel address space. And if you have an older CPU that doesn't support this mechanism, the next optimization is meant to try and help with that. Basically, in the PTE, there is a flag that marks the page as global, meaning that it won't be necessarily flashed in every change of the CR3 register. So up until now, the kernel was marked as global, but it was switched to be on the to be set on the user address space PTEs. So now, every time we transition into the kernel and switch the page table, the user space won't be flushed out of the cache, and will save some performance on that. And the last large optimization that was made is that elevated processes or administrative processes don't have this kind of shadow applied to them. So even if your machine is vulnerable, those kind of processes don't have these mechanisms applied to them. This is because they can gain access to the kernel in other ways. Because they are privileged, they can just loan their own driver to read and write the kernel address space. So there isn't really any benefit from shadowing those kind of processes as well. So when the process starts, when the system starts, the initialization process is quite short regarding the mitigation. When we start with the regular interrupt handlers, and then we get into the function that checks if the actual mitigation should be applied. Its name is KI enable KVA shadowing. Once it does actually find that the mitigation needs to be applied, it changes the interrupt handlers to the shadow version of them in the code section that we mentioned earlier. And then, if it can, it opts in to PCID if the hardware supports it, and sets the global flag KI KVA shadow to indicate that the mitigation is active. Once this function is done, the MSRs for the system calls will be set properly according to the version of the function that we need, according to the global flag. Some kernel structures that are worth mentioning that add some changes and additions to them. We start with the process. It basically represents a process in the kernel. There are 3 fields that were added to it. The user directory table base, which is the base address of the shadow page table. Address policy, which is a flag that means whether or not the current process is opted in into the mitigation. And the shadow mapping, which is the virtual address of the that corresponds to the user directory table base. And for the KPCR, some fields were added in order to enable the transitions. So those fields are being aligned and padded into a single page. So that only that page from the entire structure is being mapped to the shadow page table. So no other data will leak. The kernel directory table base is the physical address of the full page table that we use to swap in the shadow entry point. The RSP base shadow is the kernel's is the thread's kernel mode stack pointer. User RSP shadow is the place we use to save the current user mode stack pointer, and the shadow flag, which indicates whether or not this mitigation actually applies to the current running thread. So the last thing when I talk about and wrap up the internals part of the talk is how a process is created. It kind of surprised us that we saw it, but when the mitigation is enabled on the machine, every process starts out with a shadow page table. Even before it executed, when it's being created, it's also being created with a proper shadow page table, but because there was an optimization, so when privileged processes start executing, meaning when the first thread is actually starts running, it will go ahead and remove the shadow page table. So now we get into the more interesting part. We talked about a bit about the internals and how the mitigation works and stuff like that. Now let's talk about the security mechanisms that were possible to be affected from it. We start off with PatchGuard, which is a pretty old mechanism. It's opportunistic in nature. It will try and protect the kernel and run it every once in a while and check for specific contents of certain elements, such as hashes of code pages or values in the SSDT or IDT, values of MSRs, and if it detects some anomaly, it will crash the machine. HyperGuard, which is a bit newer mechanism, is deterministic in nature. It is hardware dependent, though. It's not just software. It relies on the hardware and an hypervisor to be enabled, and also provide services not for the kernel itself, but also for the hypervisor. Its method of working is a bit different. It verifies action. It doesn't check for content post-action, but because it's part of the hypervisor, it can opt in into certain events using that cause VM exits and stuff like that. So when write operations occur, you can validate them immediately. When an attempt to execute code happens, you can validate it immediately, and so on. So how can we basically bypass them? If we think about it, the limitations that they present is that we can't change any pages in the kernel because PatchGuard will catch us, and we can't really change the values of MSRs, because HyperGuard will catch us much faster than PatchGuard. But if we think about it, now what we have is a new area in the kernel, in ring 0, that runs code, but it doesn't have the kernel. So odds are it also doesn't have PatchGuard. So if we can figure out a way basically to grab hold of this area, we'll be able to bypass those protections. So apparently we can do it pretty easily. All we have to do is make the pages on the shadow page level private to them and separate them between the full page table and the shadow page table. And now we own those pages, and we can do pretty much whatever we like with them, and so on. So what we can actually do, and how we can, in practice, achieve the bypass. So first we have to locate that code section in order to switch it. It's pretty easy. We can just parse the P section table and then allocate new pages for us to use. Now we need to build our own hook. It's a bit different this time. First, if you remember, what the shadow entry point does is that it checks for if it's currently in the context of the shadow page table and switch it. So now this check is quite redundant. We know for sure that we are in the context of the shadow page table, since those pages are owned by us and are private to that page table. So we can just remove it. We don't need it anymore. And now we need to actually be able to run our own code. So if we try and run it in the shadow page table, it's possible, but we'll have some issues. We can't really use any functionality that the OS provides. We also won't have the rest of the data in the kernel space there, because that's the whole point of the shadow page table, that it will be filtered and a reduced view of the kernel itself. And another issue that will be a bit more problematic later on, but that's pretty much sealed the deal for us, is the fact that we'll have to handle the relocations on ourselves. We don't use the OS loader here, so we build the code ourselves. We have to apply relocations also ourselves. So that's pretty much not a valid option for us. But what if we could actually go back into the kernel page table, but to our own code before we get to the kernel's code? So we can just facilitate this memory context switch, but we can use a ROP gadget beforehand and make sure that we'll go to our own code. So if we look at, let's say we take a look at the binary of the page table, of the shared code section, that's the original one. If we move to the disassembler view, we can look for a ret instruction opcode, which is the last byte on the snippet. If we look at how it looks by the view of the disassembler, we can see the start of the original shadow entry point that we copied to those pages, and that will also be the same content of the page after we switch back to the kernel to the full page table. Now instead we can run it over with a ROP, with a basic ROP gadget that we built. We're going to push the address of the driver, of our driver in the full page table, and then facilitate the memory context switch by assigning the proper value to the CR3 register and using the same ret instruction that will be present in both views. So you can see now, and the last thing we have to take care of is just switching the stack. So we'll finish with the transition stack and go back to the Fred's kernel stack, and from there we are much more free to do what we want. So just to apply the hook is also very simple. All we need to do is parse the page tables and be able to change the PFNs. So we avoid of any dangerous write operations that those mechanisms can monitor, and that's how we can pretty much avoid them completely. Those page tables are accessed through physical addresses. So we can just do what a forensics tool do in order to be able to get them. Either use the physical memory device or do PT remapping on our own. We decided to go with PT remapping because we thought that there's a less of way to be detected that way. Once we get to our code and in the full shadow in the full page table, and the one last thing we have to do before we are pretty much completely free is to flush the pages of the hooked pages virtual addresses from the cache. So we will avoid any recursion, because now there is no more check of what the current memory context is, and so the hook can just call itself over and over again if it's not fleshed out. And because we control the entire page, the same as we control the entry, you can also control the exit. HVCI is another security mechanism. It's a bit outside of the scope of what we aimed to bypass, but it did present some challenges in order to implement this technique. We can no longer create our own pages on runtime, so because it actually prevents it, we either can't modify existing pages. So basically, it means that we have to rely more and more on data pages, which is not a big deal. There is enough space to map data pages into the shadow page table near the shadow entry points. And our code needs to be position independent, and then we can compile it in advance, and there won't be any issue. And our ROP gadget will look something similar to this. We'll need to get the code address and then use the data page that we set up when we install the hook, and in order to fetch the address for the driver hook, and we're pretty much free from here. So if you followed a bit, up until now we managed to bypass the protections that we wanted, bypassed PatchGuard, we bypassed HyperGuard, but now we had one small issue. Oh, it's not that small, it's quite big. We can only apply this kind of hooks and control only less privileged processes. And now, if we'll be honest, those are usually not that of a great interest to defenders or attackers. Usually, we're more interested in the privileged processes that don't have this shadow applied to them, so the hook doesn't apply to them as well. We try to understand if it was actually possible to somehow force them into the mitigation and be able to control them as well. We did manage to pull something off. If we start up with a newly created process, basically, if you remember, all you have to do when the process is created, it does have a shadow page table. So if you can find a way to prevent it from being deleted, maybe we can just use it later on. So the code that manages the deletion of the shadow page table does one interesting check on the prologue. You can see on the lower right side, that it checks the shadow mapping field value if it's null, and if so, it just skips the entire function and won't clean up those resources. So if we monitor the creation of the process, which we do, we can just save those fields and reset them. And once the process actually started running, we can opt it back in by restoring, by resynchronizing the PTEs of the user space and restoring the values. And all we have to do is resynchronize the state of the KPCR fields, which is very simple to do. We just cause a memory context switch by attaching to a different process and returning to our own. And for cleanup, we don't really need to do anything. The system takes care of it for us as well, since it is the one that allocated all the pages and all the page tables. There is no issue here. So now we get into the more experimental area. Converting a running privileged process is a bit more of a trouble because the shadow page table was already deleted. We didn't prevent it from being deleted, so we have to figure something out. But apparently it's not that complicated as well. We'll allocate a new page on our own. We then have to suspend the process so it won't run and do some memory operations. And we'll synchronize the shadow page table PML4 that we allocated. Again, we use the same synchronization for the user space, but since we allocated the page table, we also need to synchronize the kernel space for the shadow page table, which is pretty easy. We can just use the entries from the system process. We opt in the process again, setting the fields again to what we expect them to be when the mitigation is enabled, and then we continue. The difference here is that on termination, we need to opt the process back out and clean the page on our own. Otherwise, the system will crash because it will try and free resources that it didn't allocate. Udi?
Okay, so far we discussed how the mitigations enable us to bypass PatchGuard, HyperGuard, and such mitigations. Now, the mitigation that we recommended at the time was rather simple, and it was also what was eventually done. Basically, it is only the only check that needs to be added to PatchGuard is to validate that the physical pages in the shadow page table match the physical pages in the full kernel page tables for those regions that are used for transition. And then indirectly, PatchGuard will validate the shadow page pages while it validates the full kernel pages. because the first check makes sure that the physical address is the same, so it's the same memory, and then the validation that the code didn't change makes sure that it's actually the original code. However, there is a single complication that this needs to be done for every process that is currently running. Otherwise, it is still possible to hijack specific processes and take over them. So this is exactly what it does. It goes through all the running processes and makes sure that the physical page is meshed for those transition areas. This was fixed on Redstone 5 Insider build 17655. From then it was no longer possible to make those kind of hijacks. However, this tests only checks that the specific code that is used from a transition is not tampered. It is still possible to put code in the shadow page tables, execute kernel code there, put data there, and most security products don't look at that space at all. And even forensics tools normally will not look at those pages. So it is possible to put parts of rootkits there and hide data there and so on. So one possibility is to just improve PatchGuard so it will validate that those pages are empty. The page only contains the transition code that it's supposed to contain. And also it makes sense to add plugins to tools like Volatility and Recall to scan those pages as well. Basically, any code or any data in this page table that is not part of the transition code is suspicious and should not be there. And some final notes. As we all know, Meltdown and Spectre had a lot of impact. It made a lot of changes around the world, and the way we view hardware protections and stuff like that. PatchGuard was bypassed that we found was not the only issue. There was actually a very significant issue in Windows 7 that was called Total Meltdown, which was even much more than Meltdown itself. By mistake, the page table on the kernel of Windows 7 was accessible to user mode, and well, this pretty much means that you can do whatever you want on the system. So this was also paged shortly after it was discovered. The point is that when doing such big changes, you probably should review as much as possible, and even stuff that is not directly related to the architectural change. Also, it's probably going to be smart to add to take into account the shadow page tables when doing forensics and stuff like that, because as of today, it is still possible to hide stuff over there. Okay, we're pretty much done. Questions?
Here.
Are virtual cores treated the same and as vulnerable as physical cores?
I didn't really get the question.
Repeat the question.
Are virtual cores treated the same, and are they as vulnerable as and mitigated in the same way as physical cores?
Yeah, it's the same.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. So the version that you said where the fix is in, is that out yet, or?
Well,
I mean,
yeah,
that's still an insider preview, right? So basically the production version of Windows is still vulnerable to this?
No, it's already applied to the production version.
Oh, okay.
It was applied to insider build and later to the production version.
And there was another vulnerability announced today that used the swap.js thing. It's related to Spectre, so another Intel vulnerability that was patched today, and it uses the swap.js instruction to basically bypass all the previous mitigations for Spectre and Meltdown, and including Cape ATI and all that. And the question would be, and apparently Microsoft did some silent patching back in July, and it was only today they released the advisory for it because this was the disclosure date. Have you had time to look into that, or do you plan to look at the mitigations for that, because there are some new mitigations there?
We did not review it yet, and yes, we will, but we didn't have time to do it yet.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone else? All right, thank you so much.